My name is Rubenstein, and I'm the Director of Education for International Arts of the Living, and it is my privilege to give this presentation on behalf of the Two Museums program. And this evening, I'm going to share with you 10 universal lessons of the Holocaust. There are many other lessons that perhaps one can suggest, but these are 10 universal lessons of the Holocaust that I'd like to share with you this evening. And I want to begin by saying that much of this lecture is based on the wisdom I've learned from many Holocaust survivors and Holocaust scholars over the years who I've had the privilege of being taught by. One of them was Professor Stephen Katz, among others, who I'm greatly indebted for some of the material that I'm presenting today. I'd like to start off with the first of 10 universal lessons of the Holocaust. The first one is the fragility of our civilization. Scratch the surface of our society and our civilization, and the most demonic forces lying underneath can become resonant. It doesn't take much. It could be an economic depression, a natural disaster, a pandemic. It could be some other phenomenon that drags civilization down to the road of ruin. We often think we're protected by our culture, by our civility, by our traditions, and by our laws. But if we don't have a strong society that implements these laws and traditions and that forcefully defends them, the worst of our impulses can come to the fore and eventually crush us. A piece of paper with rules written on it will not defend us in times of crisis. It comes down to civic will and the moral character of the majority of the people to resist tyranny. One of the teachers I've studied with was Professor Yehuda Bauer of blessed memory. And he once said the following line, which still resonates with me to this day. He said, "The only thing Jews were guilty of during the Holocaust was failing to imagine the unimaginable." What did he mean by this? Go to the streets of Germany, let's say Berlin, 1932. Walk over to a Jewish citizen of Germany who perhaps fought in the First World War, and tell that citizen of Germany, this Jewish German, tell him, in 10 years from now, the country that you fought for in World War I, the country that you love and cherish, is going to be building gas chambers all across Poland, and they're going to be dragging millions of Jews through deportations into these gas chambers, going to be you wouldn't even finish the sentence. The German Jew would look at you and say, "You're out of your mind. My country, my culture, which produced Beethoven and Mozart and Schiller and Goethe, could never do something like that." And he would have been correct to say that at the time, but he also would have been dead wrong, because that's exactly what happened 10 years later. That high culture with so many incredibly artistic virtues and morals and laws and traditions descended into the deepest, darkest depths of humanity. The fragile veneer of civilization was shattered to reveal the animal instinct beneath. I'm reminded of a story which reflects the same idea, that civilizations are only as strong as people are able to uphold it. The story goes of a little girl who was visiting the Statue of Liberty with her father, and she has the torch in her hand. And the little girl looked at her father and said, "Daddy, doesn't she get tired of holding that torch? Doesn't her arm get tired?" And her father said, "Yes. And the only way she can hold it up is if we support her arm. If we support her arm, she won't drop the flame of liberty." So civilization is very fragile, and the only way it keeps going, the only way it can keep its morals intact, if we stand up and fight for it every day, will not happen automatically. The second universal lesson that we learned from the Holocaust is about the power of ideas, the power of ideologies, both good and bad. Human beings are susceptible to following ideas that become viral, both negative and positive. You can have a society that celebrates goodness and kindness and social responsibility, or you can have a society based on the principles of Sodom, of cruelty and selfishness and meanness. During the Holocaust, you had two kinds of destructive ideologies at play. First of all, you had the deification of Adolf Hitler, a leader who was worshipped as literally a god among much of German citizenry. Today, we watch some of Hitler's speeches, and he seems like a lunatic frothing at the mouth. Less than a century ago, people looked at him as their Messiah, the one who was going to lead them out of the wilderness into a utopian society. Just to give you an example of how extreme the ideology was in terms of people being able to be brainwashed by a leader, I'm reminded of the story that Eli Gotz told. Eli Gotz is a Holocaust survivor from Lithuania, very, very powerful speaker, and he told the following story. He said, in the 1960s, he went back to Germany on business. And one of the people at the firm he was doing business with, I think he might have been the vice president or the chief accountant, said, "I'd like to go out for lunch with you." And they go out for lunch, and he admits to Eli Gotz that when he was a youth in his teens, he joined the Hitler Youth. And Ellie says to him, and obviously he knew Ellie was Jewish, that's why he was telling the story to him. Well, I suppose you had to, trying to give him a way out. He says, no, I joined it because I wanted to. And in fact, my father said to me, don't go with these people. They're dangerous. They're evil. They're not good. And my father kept pushing me. And one day I said to my father, Father, you say one more word to me, I'm going to report you to the SS. And Ellie looked at him and said, you were going to report your own father to the SS? Didn't you love your father? Of course I loved my father. Well, how could you do such a thing? That could have meant the death of your father. And he looked at Ellie and said, you don't understand. When that man spoke, meaning Hitler, a chill ran down my spine. I would have done anything for him. Anything. That's the spell this man was under because of Adolf Hitler. And Ellie concluded his story with the following words. I'm going to quote. And then that man said something to me that I want all you students, he was speaking to the students at the time, to remember. He said to me, I want you to understand, I joined the Nazi Party not because I wanted to be a murderer. I joined because I was an idealist. I was prepared to give my life for my country. And then Ellie looked at the students and said, remember that. Remember those words. Young people can be led to hell singing. Young people like to be idealistic. Young people at 18 are willing to give themselves over to some greater cause than themselves. But we can be misled. And we can go singing, doing terrible things. And Ellie would say, be careful who you believe. Be careful who you follow. And if a politician comes along and says, I have all the answers in the world to all the questions, be careful, listen to someone else because you're being hypnotized. So that was the first part of the Holocaust, this people abdicating their freedom of choice and believing in a false Messiah. The second powerful force is that of ideology, where an entire society was brainwashed into the pseudoscientific belief of racial hierarchy. Without even the slightest scientific evidence, an entire society was brainwashed to believe that Aryans were at the top of the food chain, everyone else was below, and that Jews were at the bottom, inherently polluted because of their DNA, the very blood that ran through their system. And let me just give you an example of how extreme this ideology affected certain people. There's a woman in Montreal, her name is Gina Reutemann, and she tells a story about how when she was a little girl, her mother would say, after the Holocaust, I was in a DP camp near Passau, and when you were born, I made sure your life was saved. What do you mean? Because something strange was going on in the DP camp, so I made sure that when I gave birth to you, I went to the hospital in Passau, not in the DP camp. What did her mother mean? She didn't know. Years later, she went back to Passau and she discovered the following fact. In 1947, a German nurse was caught and tried for the murder of 52 little Jewish children who were just born in that DP camp at Passau. In other words, what happened was in that camp, this German nurse was murdering all the babies being born, and her mother, Gina's mother, realized something was wrong, and so made sure she was born in the city or the town as opposed to the camp, so she wouldn't be victim of this German nurse. So think of this. The Holocaust is over. 60 million, if not more, people are dead. Germany is in ruins. Adolf Hitler has killed himself. And 2 years after this tremendous tragedy, this tremendous disaster, a German nurse who sworn to protect human life is strangling seconds-old infants with her bare hands. That is the power of ideology. The power of a false ideology. The third universal lesson of the Holocaust has to do with the mystery of the human person. What is meant by this? The Holocaust shows that there were people who exhibited such enormous cruelty that it's hard to even fathom what dark recesses exist in their soul, where this evil sprouted from. People during the Holocaust acted in such barbarous fashions that it's even difficult to describe the cruel acts without feeling sickened to the core of your soul. Murdering children in front of their parents, burying infants alive, locking people inside synagogues and setting them on fire and burning them alive, the most horrific medical experiments. The litany of cruelty during the Holocaust is as unbearable as it is almost infinite. Yet at the same time, during the same period of time, the Holocaust produced people who exhibited such acts of courage and self-sacrifice and humanity that it's hard even to imagine any of us doing the same. People risked their lives and sometimes their families' lives to save complete strangers without the hope of any reward, often paying the ultimate price, their own lives, for their sacrifice. Yet both these extremes represent humanity. One is the best example, and one is the worst example. Both of these kinds of human beings had mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, and hearts that beat inside their chests. Yet the paths they chose were as symmetrically opposed as you can possibly imagine. That is a third universal lesson of the Holocaust, the mystery of the human person, the extremes that people are able to descend to or to rise to. The fourth universal lesson has to do with the need for inculcating a deep moral obligation on our children. As important as the maths and sciences are, our educational systems need to, above all, teach the value of human rights and the dignity of the individual. At the Wannsee Conference in 1942, when it was decided formally to implement the final solution, over half of the 15 officials who attended the conference, 8 in fact, held academic doctorates. All were very educated, but none of them were educated in the most important lesson, and that is the infinite value of each and every human life. I want to share with you a story about Miloj Pavlovic, the principal of the Women's Teaching Academy in central Serbia, which was under German occupation during the war. When the Germans organized a mass reprisal shooting on October of 1941 and ended up murdering 3,000 civilians in a single day, he refused to have his life spared by the Germans and instead joined his students in their death. He could have saved his life, but he went to his death with his students. He was pronounced the national hero of Yugoslavia in 1953, and the words that he was supposed to have said, "Go on, shoot me, I'm still teaching a lesson as we speak," are etched into a memorial complex on the site of the massacre. So remember those words. He sacrificed his life, refusing to abandon his students, and what were his last words? "I am still teaching a lesson." What do we learn from that story? Teaching is not just about facts and figures. It's about imparting integrity and courage and humane values, and even more importantly, exemplifying those values in your own actions, as this truly noble teacher did. On the subject of teaching and setting an example, I often think of the story of Raphael Scharf and his beloved teacher, Benzion Rappaport. Raphael Scharf grew up in Krakow, and he was a little boy attending a very religious school, and his teacher was Benzion Rappaport. And around the time of his bar mitzvah, Raphael became quite religious, so religious that he began to pray all day, and he told his mother, "I don't want to go to school anymore. All I want to do is pray all day." And so his mother, very concerned, spoke to the teacher, and the teacher called Raphael in for a meeting. And he said the following words to Raphael, words that he remembered for the rest of his life. He said to Raphael, "You're a little boy. These prayers you're saying every day, they're long and complicated and actually too deep for you to even understand at your age. And you want to serve God, right? That's why you're praying. You actually serve God by coming to school. And about prayer, you know what? I'll tell you what the essence of prayer is. The essence of prayer is to get up every morning and ask yourself, what is my obligation? What is my duty? What is my responsibility to the world?" That's the essence of prayer. When you get older, you can learn more about other prayers. But I want you every morning to get up and ask yourself, what is my obligation? What is my duty? What do I have to do to make the world a better place? That should be what you should be doing at this age. His teacher, Benzion Rappaport, was deported to one of the camps where he perished. Raphael Scharf was lucky to have escaped Poland before the war, but for the rest of his life, he got up every morning, and he would wake up in the morning and ask himself the following question: how can I make the world a better place? What is my obligation? What is my responsibility to the rest of humanity? Imagine this for a moment. If in Germany, before the war, every single German child was taught that lesson, that when they get up in the morning, they have to ask themselves, how can I make the world a better place? What is my obligation, my duty to help my fellow members of the human race? Do you think a Holocaust could have ever happened? I don't think so. Such an important lesson about the teaching of children to prevent other genocides. If I may add, another incredible teacher that I also think about when it comes to the Holocaust was Janusz Korczak. Janusz Korczak was an exceptional individual. He ran a number of orphanages in Warsaw before the war, one Jewish, one non-Jewish, and he was a celebrated hero not just among the Jewish people, but among the Polish people as well. And he came up with what was then a novel concept, that a child should not be considered as a half a human being, but should be considered as a full human being with rights and an inalienable dignity. He came up with this concept when he was a little boy. His bird died, and he went to bury the bird, and his governess said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm burying my bird. I feel terrible." She said, "What a foolish little boy you are. Birds are a different species. Go throw it in the garbage." And he said to himself, no, it's not birds and human beings that are different species. It's adults and children. They don't understand this. When he got older, he decided to dedicate his life to children's rights. And he ran an orphanage in Warsaw where the rule was all of the rules in the orphanage were voted upon by the children. It was a democracy. And one of the rules in the orphanage was you couldn't slide down a banister. And kids kept changing and breaking that rule. And one day, Korczak said, let me try this myself. And he slid down the banister. And one of the kids saw him. And he said, no, don't worry, Dr. Korczak. We won't put you on trial. And Korczak said, no, I should be on trial like everybody else. He ran the orphanage like a democracy. In the 1930s, he visited Palestine a few times. He went to a kibbutz in Harod. And he noticed that the children were bored. So he said to them, why don't you learn to fly a kite? And he taught the children how to fly kites. And why was that so important? Because he felt that every children should not just fly a kite, but like a kite, feel that they can touch the sky. They have infinite and endless potential. That's how he believed in children. One other little story about Janusz Korczak I'd like to share with you. One day he invited the orchestra to come to play for his children. The orchestra's conductor said, your children are orphans, we want to do something good for them. Come, please. Korczak said, play some beautiful music for my children. And so they came. But unfortunately, the music they were playing did not appeal to the children. It was classical music that was too complex for them. And after a few minutes, the children became bored, became distracted, and became a little bit rude and rowdy. And finally, the conductor threw down his baton and looked at Korczak and said, what's wrong with your children that they can't sit still for my beautiful music? And Korczak looked at the conductor and said, what is wrong with you that you can't play music for my children that they can sit still for? Beautiful lesson about when you teach children, always reaching down to their level, not forcing them when they're not ready to hear what you want them to hear. Janusz Korczak had one rule. You never lied to children. But he broke that rule once. And I'll tell you about that in a moment. During the Holocaust, Janusz Korczak had many opportunities to escape because he was such a beloved folk hero among the entire population, as I said, the Jewish and the non-Jewish population. But he refused. He refused to abandon his orphans inside the ghetto, as a captain doesn't abandon a ship. He would not abandon the hundreds of orphans that looked upon him like a real father. So he refused all those opportunities to escape, and he went with them to their deaths. And this is where he broke his rule. One day in August of 1942, the Nazis came to Korczak and said, you have half an hour to bring all your children to the Umschlagplatz, a deportation place where they all would be sent to Treblinka. Korczak knew what would happen, but he couldn't tell the children what was really happening. So he went to them and said, children, we're going on a march. We're going on a picnic. Take your favorite clothing, your dolls and toys, and our green flag of hope, and we're going to march towards the sun. And all the children got together. They marched through the streets of Warsaw. And I've met Holocaust survivors who still to this day remember seeing those children march through the streets of Warsaw to the Umschlagplatz, to the deportation. Korczak could not tell them the horrible truth, the horrible fate that was awaiting them. And they arrived in Treblinka sometime later, where they were murdered with close to 900,000 other Jewish people. And if you go to Treblinka today, there are something like 17,000 stones, each of them representing a different Jewish community wiped out in Europe, with no names of any individuals except for one, that of Janusz Korczak and the children. If every single German child was taught the lessons and the life example of Janusz Korczak, the kindness and the gentleness and the love he had for children, do you think a Holocaust could have happened? Do you think anybody else who commits a genocide would have done it had they studied the teachings and life of Janusz Korczak? I don't think so. So again, this lesson teaches us the importance of educating young children from the earliest possible age about kindness and about the infinite dignity of every human race. The fifth universal lesson of the Holocaust is about the need for an unlimited sense of moral obligation. In other words, who belongs to us? When it comes to protecting human life, there should never be an us and a them. Regardless of country, race, or religion, we all belong to each other. We all belong to the same human family. Khalil Gibran once said, the whole earth is my birthplace, and all humans are my brothers. I'm reminded of the story of Romain Dallaire, Canadian general who headed up the UN force in Rwanda during the genocide. He did everything possible to try to stop the genocide from happening, and he failed. And he was so upset with his failure, when he came back to Canada, he even contemplated taking his own life. And yet he was one of the only people that opposed it. And this genocide was unfolding in front of the entire world's eyes. In fact, when the Belgian soldiers returned from Rwanda, when they were brought back prematurely, they knew this genocide was going to happen because they were begged by many of the Tutsis to be shot as opposed to being hacked to death, which was happening to them after they leave. They knew this was happening. When they arrived back in Belgium, they took their berets off of their heads, burnt them on the tarmacs, and said, "We have left innocent people to slaughter." So Rome Dallaire is middle of the genocide, a genocide which took more lives at a more rapid pace than the pace of the Holocaust. Something close to 1 million, mostly Tutsis, are murdered in the span of a few months, mostly in the most brutal fashion possible, being hacked to death. Rome Dallaire arrives in a small village. The entire village has been wiped out except for one child, bruised, battered, and bleeding. And Dallaire picks up the child gently, and he says to himself as he's doing this, "What am I doing here? Thousands of miles away from home, different culture, different people, different everything." Then he looked into the child's eyes, and you know what he saw? The same eyes as his children at home, wanting protection, wanting love, wanting to be cared for. And then he realized, you know what? No human is more human than any other human. No human is more human than any other human. And the reason why genocides happen, the reason why Holocausts happen, is we haven't learned that very simple lesson. We have a shared humanity, and that no human is more human than any other human. So that for me is the fifth universal lesson of the Holocaust, recognizing the common humanity we all share. No human is more human than any other human. The sixth universal lesson of the Holocaust has to do with the power of bureaucracy to deaden moral imperatives. It is so easy for human beings to deflect responsibility with anonymity by hiding behind closed doors and blaming others, thus allowing the machinery of death to move forward. There is a need to put in place a system that checks the unbridled power of bureaucrats and bureaucracies. Hannah Arendt famously coined the phrase, the banality of evil. When she used that phrase, the banality of evil, she was referring to Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was one of Hitler's main architects for the final solution. But to Arendt, he did not seem to be an ideological driven monster bent on destroying the entire Jewish people. Instead, to her, he seemed as a simple, boring, nondescript man just following orders. Now, many people disagree with Arendt's description of Eichmann, and that's another discussion. But her larger truth rings sound, which is to say that genocides and Holocausts happen not just because they're committed by maniacs like Hitler, who are frothing at the mouth like genocidal monsters. Genocides and the Holocaust happen because of the mid and low-level bureaucrats who designed the plans for the gas chambers in Auschwitz-Birkenau, who kept the trains running to the death camps, and the local bureaucrats who helped round up the Jewish populations in European towns and villages. Those people who are involved in this bureaucracy, they themselves may not have been anti-Semites in their hearts, but by sitting at their desks and filling out the paperwork, they surely helped these monstrous activities to occur. So in other words, the sixth lessons of the Holocaust is that in order for a Holocaust or a genocide to happen, it's not just the evil monsters at the top who are directing the orders, but there's a whole chain of people going right down to the bottom level of the bureaucracy who, by filing papers and following orders and doing even the smallest actions, facilitate the activities of these genocidal dictators. The seventh lesson, the seventh universal lessons of the Holocaust, has to do with discarding our naive beliefs about power, self-aggrandizement, and self-interest. Hitler did not win the most votes in Germany's election before he took over the government. But through backroom dealing, craven and power-hungry German politicians engineered his ascent to power, thinking it would give them the power behind the throne. Never underestimate the desire for political power and the methods and deals some politicians will undertake to achieve the power they so desperately seek. If you look at the world today, you'll often see politicians who at one time you might have admired actually make deals with the devil to preserve their own political power. They rationalize that once they're in power, they'll do more good. But instead, they themselves become the very instruments of evil. They become a stamp of legitimacy for the very totalitarian leaders they have sold out to. The eighth universal lesson of the Holocaust has to do with demonizing the other. All genocides have this in common, the demonizing of the other. And while they may differ in scope, ideology, methodology, and technology, it is its fundamental marginalizing of a specific group and subjecting them to intense persecution and eventual annihilation that is consistent across all genocides. Which means we must equally oppose the attempt by anyone who attempts to marginalize or demonize any other group in their society, whether it's us or another marginalized group. perfect example for me is a story about Dennis Erstein, a member of my synagogue and someone who I had the very sacred honor of performing his funeral. And among the many stories that stood out to me from his remarkable life was the following. Now, Dennis Erstein was born actually Adolf Erstein, but you'll find out in a moment why his name was changed. He was sent to Auschwitz, survived somehow, Auschwitz and other camps as well. He was a young man. He was in his teens at the time. And he was very charismatic, very handsome, very engaging young man. And the American soldiers who liberated him really liked him. They liked his personality, but they said, you can't be called Adolf. And they changed his name from Adolf to Dennis because they both had a D. He welcomed the change in name. And one day, these American soldiers who almost took Dennis as a mascot for them, they said to him, what do you miss most about your former life? I'd love to hear some jazz. Sure. And they take him to a jazz club that night. And Dennis is having the time of his life. Here he is, where a few months ago he was in a camp within moments of losing his life, not knowing if he'd live another day. And here he is. The war is over. These American soldiers are protecting him. He's enjoying jazz. Life couldn't be any better. And then everything changes in a split second, because just then another American soldier walked into the club. And when his American soldier friends saw this, they went ahead and they beat the living daylights out of this other soldier. Dennis was completely traumatized, ran away, and for weeks he didn't see those American soldiers again. And then one day by accident, they bumped into each other. The American officer says, Dennis, what happened? We're buddies, we're friends. Where did you disappear to? Dennis says, no, we could never be friends. But why? I'll tell you why. That night, when that American soldier came into the bar and you jumped on him and beat him viciously, almost taking his life away from him, you showed me something. You beat him for one reason, because he was black. And you showed me that you're no different than the Nazis who tried to take my life and my family's life away. And with that, Dennis turned his back on the people that saved his life, gave him a new life, gave him a new name. Why? Because racism is racism is racism. Whether it's against Jews, against blacks, against Muslims, against anyone, racism is wrong. And that's an important lesson that Dennis teaches us. I'm reminded of a very famous quote from Pastor Martin Niemöller, who wrote, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. We have to fight against racism, regardless who the victim is. The ninth universal lesson of the Holocaust has to do with the upstanders, the exceptions to the rule, those who defied the kingdom of night and stood up and risked their lives to save their fellow neighbors and sometimes complete strangers. During every genocide, there are those who try to resist, risking their lives to save often total strangers. In the most perilous of times, under the most extreme circumstances, there are always people whose humanity shines like a beacon of light over the ages. When it looked like all hope was lost, when it looked like there was not a shred of humanity to be found, these people showed us that even in the darkest corners of the universe, it is still possible to find human dignity, bravery, and courage. The essential goodness of these individuals could not be eclipsed, could not be held down or overcome, even by the most powerful, brutal, and sadistic force. During the Holocaust, we refer to these people as the righteous among the nations, who not only saved Jewish life during the Holocaust, but saved the very reputation of humanity. So what we learn from this is that in every genocide, there are people who resisted, there are people who had backbone and moral fiber, and were able to turn back the forces of tyranny, and we can do so as well. There's not been a single example of genocide where there haven't been those individuals that risked enough and gave their lives to save others. During every genocide, you'll find these remarkable souls who inspire us every day and to this very day. The 10th and final universal lesson of the Holocaust has to do with the essential nature of humanity. Anne Frank famously said that she believed that people are good at heart. And yet she was challenged by Bruno Bettelheim, another refugee from the Holocaust, who said, if people are really good at heart, how was ever in Auschwitz? How can you say people are good at heart and yet know the existence of a place like Auschwitz? And please note that Anne Frank wrote these words when she was being hidden by righteous among the nations in an attic in Amsterdam. Would Anne Frank have said these same words when she was in Auschwitz? Or when she was dying of typhus with her sister in Bergen-Belsen? And we'll never know the answer to that question. But let me conclude by saying the following. I believe that Anne Frank was right for the most part when she said people are good at heart. I believe most people are good at heart. I think we all come across on an everyday basis with our neighbors and our friends and our family members and our acquaintances and people we meet on the street. And for the most part, they seem like they want to do the right thing, and they seem good-natured and good-hearted. So if that's true, if most people are good at heart, how did the Holocaust ever happen? And the answer is, it's not good enough just to be good at heart. One must also act upon those convictions. And the true reason the Holocaust happened wasn't just because a small group of evil, maniacal monsters seized hold of power and implemented their drastic and their dastardly plans. It happened just as much because the majority of good people did not resist. As the famous quote goes, in order for evil to triumph, all good men have to do is nothing. And I cannot emphasize this point enough. The Holocaust did not happen just because a small group of evil people acted upon it. It's because the majority of good people did not resist sufficiently. So of all the universal lessons of the Holocaust I've discussed, I think the paramount one is that for people to be real moral people is not good enough just to be good at heart, but one must act on the inner goodness and take a stand in the face of injustice. Then and only then will we live up to the promise of Anne Frank's words. And let me leave you with another quote from Anne Frank, who once said, "How wonderful it is that we don't need to wait a single moment to improve the world." And let's all begin that by doing it now. We've now come to the close of our lecture, 10 Universal Lessons of the Holocaust. So now let me close with not a universal lesson, but one last message. There are two questions that often arise during the study of the Holocaust. The first question is, why did it happen? How could people have descended to such low levels of barbarity and cruelty? I've spent my entire life studying the Holocaust, and I don't think I'll ever find an answer to that question, and perhaps that's a good thing. I shall never understand how people acted the way they did during that terrible period of time. But there's a second question, which is even more important, and to that question I do have an answer. And that is the question of how do we respond to the Holocaust? And as I said, to that question I do have an answer. And this answer, this response, is based on the words of Roman Kent, a survivor of Auschwitz, who despite everything he went through, had this to say about what he learned from the Holocaust. He said the following: no matter what you believe and what you think, always know this: hate is never right and love is never wrong. And to that question, how to respond to the Holocaust? Like Roman Kent, the answer is we should be loving more and hating less. You see, Hitler tried to create a world of endless hatred, endless hostility, and endless brutality. We must do, in fact, the exact opposite. In place of blind hatred, we must create a world of blind love. For the answer to hatred is not more hatred, but more love and more light. Thank you.